In Los Angeles, forensics experts try to make sense of a photo shoot that crossed the line from daring to deadly. In the Pacific Northwest, law enforcement hunts a brutal predator whose lust for violence is reaching fever pitch. As detectives follow the footsteps of a killer, a double homicide investigation spurs an international manhunt. The law has no jurisdiction in the human mind, where a killer's twisted motives may forever defy police. But actions cannot defy science. Through forensics, detectives can track even the most deranged criminals and put an end to their lethal obsessions. In Los Angeles, where image is everything, a pretty face and sexy body can launch a woman into the spotlight. But not everyone makes it that far. In November 1995, a model went to a photo shoot and vanished. Days went by without a word. Worried friends and parents had no clue to her whereabouts. Then, she caught the eye of a passing stranger. One afternoon, a trash collector working along the Angeles Crest Highway found a daydream in the litter.
The 27-year-old model.
Several days later, he saw the woman's face again.
Disappeared 7 days ago.
She was Linda Sobek, a model from Hermosa Beach who had been missing for 5 days. He contacted the police about his odd discovery.
Yeah, hi, this is Frank Artino. Yeah, I'm calling about that girl that you have on TV.
A former LA Raider cheerleader, 27-year-old Sobek was riding a wave of success. Her schedule was packed with shoots for magazine covers and calendar spreads. She had just landed a part on a popular sitcom. The day she disappeared, Linda told her mother that she would be at a remote photo shoot with a photographer named Chuck. Her mother didn't know who Chuck was or where they were going. Linda promised to call her after the shoot. No call ever came. The trash collector showed police where he dumped the roadside trash.
Yeah, I threw him in here with one of these bags, but this bag right here.
This bag?
There, they found more photographs, pages ripped from Sobek's appointment book, and a makeup bag. They also found a clue they hoped would lead them to the model. The receipt was for the loan of a sport utility vehicle, a prototype that hadn't been released yet. It was signed by Charles Rathbun and dated November 16th, the same day Sobek disappeared. It seemed the mysterious Chuck had been identified. Rathbun, police learned, was a respected photographer who specialized in pictures of new cars. He was considered one of the best in his field. Rathbun said he didn't know how his receipt got mixed in with Linda Sobek's belongings, but admitted that he was probably the last person to have seen her. On the morning of her disappearance, he said, Sobek asked him to meet her at a restaurant parking lot. She was looking for work. He wasn't interested. Detective Mike Robinson of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department took Rathbun's statement.
He said that he met with her briefly in the Denny's parking lot, looked at her portfolio, and told her that he had a very tight schedule and pushed her out of the car and left her there at noon on the day she disappeared. He said his last observation of her was standing in the parking lot unlocking her white Datsun.
Sobek's car was still in the parking lot. But there, the trail grew cold. Rathbun, the last to have seen her, was the only lead to the missing model. Police asked him to come to the station for a more complete interview. He didn't keep his appointment.
He called later that day and said that he had car problems and then never showed up and never called back.
But police learned that Rathbun had contacted a friend in law enforcement. She had received a rambling fax in which he confessed to accidentally killing Sobek. He also threatened to kill himself. Police rushed to his house. They found him drunk and incoherent. He was taken into custody. In jail, Rathbun gave police a second account of what happened. He admitted that he'd lied when he said he hadn't hired Linda Sobek. He recounted a tragic accident at a dry lake bed in the Mojave Desert. Rathbun wanted to photograph Linda taking the rugged prototype through its paces. He got behind the wheel to show her how to spin it. He claimed he had lost control of the 2.5-ton vehicle, and the rear end slammed into Sobek, killing her. Panicked, Rathbun dug a grave with his hands and abandoned the body. He said he was so traumatized, he couldn't remember where he'd buried her. Police didn't believe this sudden change of story. But with nothing more to go on, they couldn't refute his account. Flimsier alibis have held up in court. Investigators were not about to let that happen. The case entered its next phase, to find the flaws in Rathbun's story. Police got hold of the car. Unfortunately, it had been detailed at least twice since Rathbun borrowed it. Investigators hoped that some evidence survived the thorough cleaning. The first task was to search for signs of impact. LA County criminalist Heidi Robbins didn't find any.
The initial examination revealed no such evidence on the exterior of the car. Being that it was a prototype, it was a brand new vehicle right off the line, so it was very clean, which is really not what we're used to looking at as forensic scientists or criminalists. The vehicle it didn't have a scratch on it. There wasn't a dent to be seen.
Perhaps the victim had been run over, not struck. The vehicle was placed on a lift. Again, the car was clean.
We didn't see any type of blood or tissue or fiber evidence at all associated with the exterior or undercarriage of that vehicle.
The next step was to examine the vehicle's interior. Although the leather seating looked pristine, it was not. Blood residue was found in the crevice between the seat cushions and had stained the stitching. Tests showed that it matched Sobek's blood type. 4 long blonde hairs were collected and shown to have belonged to her. Robbins noticed that one of the doors had a deep dent in it. It seemed that a struggle may have occurred inside. The marks inside the car suggested a tale far different from Rathbun's, but the whole story couldn't be told without Sobek's body, and Rathbun had conveniently forgotten where it was. In custody, he tried to commit suicide, asserting that it was all a mistake. He wrote in his own blood that he never meant to hurt anyone. The act could be read as either despair or cunning calculation. In an apparent attempt to prove his sincerity, 8 days after Linda Sobek had disappeared, Rathbun recalled where he had buried her. He directed the search party to a steep ravine, 6,000 feet up, 40 miles from the site of the photo shoot. Buried more than a week, the remains would probably yield few clues about the factors that led to her death.
It's always been my contention that Rathbun decided to contribute to our efforts on the day that he did because he felt that the body would be so decomposed that we wouldn't be able to determine those factors.
For Detective Robinson, Rathbun's confession and suicide attempt didn't ring true. To him, the photographer was artfully controlling the investigation, meting out information too little, too late. His sudden recollection of the burial site was the latest example. Supervised by a forensic anthropologist, Robin's team carefully removed the body. Each rock from the top of the grave was numbered and cataloged. Inch by inch, soil was lifted from the grave, then sifted and analyzed. After 8 hours, investigators had their most crucial piece of evidence. 2 feet down, they found Sobek. Much to their surprise, the elements had spared her.
There was very little degradation, and I think due to the coldness and that altitude and the ravine that she was buried in had such minimal amount of sun exposure, she essentially was refrigerated for those 9 days.
Investigators surveyed the body. Had the victim been struck by a car, she would have had knee-level injuries. Her legs showed no broken bones or abrasions, but they did bear severe ligature marks. It appeared she'd been bound around the ankles. The condition of her clothes also suggested something more than a luckless accident and hasty burial.
Most women are probably comfortable wearing a zip top somewhere maybe in the center of their chest. And Linda's clothing was zipped all the way up to the base of her neck. I thought that's a very unnatural position, and to me, when you see clothing that has a bit of an unnatural position, it indicates the possibility that there may have been some redress or some alteration of the clothing.
The unnatural position of her clothes suggested that Rathbun had dressed her, possibly after her death. And apparently, by trying to wipe away evidence, Rathbun inadvertently created a second clue that revealed he wasn't telling the full story.
She was a model. She wore makeup. She was on a photo shoot. And when she was recovered from that grave, there was a complete absence of any makeup or any residues thereof that we could detect in the crime scene. And that concerned me also.
The condition of her clothing, makeup, and the marks around her ankles suggested that the victim wasn't just standing around before she died. Something else was going on, and it pointed to murder. Linda Sobek was photographed for the last time on the autopsy table. From marks on her body, the medical examiner could tell that she had been smothered. Hemorrhaging in the eyes showed the breath was literally squeezed out of her, and she hadn't gone without a struggle. Her wrist was sprained. She had been tied up. The physical evidence shattered Rathbun's story of a car accident. As the case went to trial, a first-degree murder charge seemed inevitable, but Rathbun wasn't finished. In a bid for a manslaughter conviction, he offered another account of what happened. His new version explained away all of the evidence. In what was now Rathbun's third rendition, he claimed that Sobek began to undress and strike erotic poses. He said she was a tease. She became upset when he took pictures of her. He set the camera aside and they started kissing, but she wouldn't let it go further. After things cooled down and she got dressed, Rathbun showed her how to make the car spin. But he was too reckless. He thought he hit and killed her, but she'd only stumbled trying to get clear. She cut her face when she fell. Rathbun told authorities he put her in the car to take her to the hospital. She became hysterical, fighting with him and threatening a lawsuit. He tried to restrain her with a bear hug, but she only grew more agitated and more violent. As a last resort, he sat on her. She finally grew quiet. Then he realized she wasn't breathing. He pulled her out of the car to try to revive her, but she was dead. To explain the ligature marks, Rathbun said he then bound the model's ankles to better maneuver the unwieldy body back into the vehicle. He then buried her. It was a colorful story, but once again, it felt too contrived.
I felt that in trying to answer every piece of evidence that the prosecution had presented, he sort of built a patchwork quilt that wasn't real square at the edges. It just didn't have the right form to it.
If Rathbun could sell this fabrication to the jury, he'd likely get off with manslaughter. To prove his case, Rathbun provided the court with 5 rolls of film from the photo shoot. He explained that he had left them in the desert after the victim was killed. He had his brother retrieve them for him. 4 of the rolls showed Sobek modeling, but the 5th roll was almost unrecognizable. Rathbun explained that it contained the intimate photos of Linda Sobek that proved she was teasing him. But in the heat of the moment, he'd grabbed a roll he'd already shot. Not realizing, he took pictures of Linda Sobek over pictures of the Lexus interior. The harsh desert climate also had apparently affected the rolls, ruining the emulsion. Rathbun presented 13 distorted images of a woman in pornographic poses, double exposed over a car interior. And along with them, he served up a modified version of what happened. This version better explained the condition of the victim's clothes and makeup.
At this point in time, the facts of the story changed. We had another version of the truth come out at this point, and it was suggested that her death actually resulted not from a vehicle this time, but from this consensual sexual activity that had gotten out of hand, a little too rough, and accidentally resulted in her death. These photographs were introduced to prove this latest version of the truth.
Investigators set out to prove the photos were fakes. Detective Robinson felt the pictures were too damaged to be conclusive. He needed to determine if the Lexus and the woman in these photos were really who Rathbun said they were. He learned that several weeks before borrowing the Lexus, Rathbun had photographed a 1998 Oldsmobile prototype. The detective requested Rathbun's pictures of that car's interior from the manufacturer. Heidi Robbins brought the double-exposed images and the Oldsmobile interiors to the National Law Enforcement and Corrections Technology Center in El Segundo, California, for comparison. The agency provides sophisticated forensic imaging technology for law enforcement. The images were scanned into a high-speed computer and enhanced with graphics software. Before they could make sense, engineer Bill Repetto digitally enhanced their contrast, shadow detail, and color.
The films are in really bad shape. In fact, a lot of the emulsion is missing. So the detectives really didn't have a full shot of the entire dashboard. Using our equipment, we were able to alter the contrast, do some sharpening, look for features that were hard to do in the conventional photographic process, but we can do it in real time on a computer. So I guess you're interested in finding out, is that a body part or is that part of the dashboard?
Once the pictures were sharpened, Repetto sized and overlaid the Oldsmobile dashboard atop the damaged negative. His goal was to see if the car in the photos was really the Lexus that Sobek died in, or if it was the Oldsmobile.
That you can match up things like the speedometer dial, the radius of the steering wheel. Unfortunately, we can't see this pattern, the logo on the steering wheel, but it matches up pretty good. I mean, you work with this just a few minutes and it's pretty darn obvious this is not a Lexus. This is an Oldsmobile.
Repetto next had to eliminate Linda Sobek as the faceless model. He compared the dress Sobek wore at the photo shoot to a portion of lace shown in the double-exposed images. Because lace patterns repeat, it only takes a fragment of the material to point out a mismatch.
Now in this image, you can see that there's a definite pattern here. There's a boot-shaped mark, you know, vertical feature, and it bends over to the left, and that's repeated up here.
The lace patterns were inconsistent. So were comparisons between Sobek's anatomy and the model in the photos. Rathbun's latest account was disproven.
The defense, on their fourth and final version of the truth, when the defendant took the stand, had to go up and explain all the physical evidence findings and the circumstances surrounding the death. And in his testimony, he did initially state that this was the Lexus and that this was in fact Linda Sobek. And it was very powerful rebuttal testimony when the jury could see for themselves that not only was this not the Lexus, but this clearly was not Linda Sobek.
Once again, the facts contradicted Rathbun's story. The jury didn't buy any of Rathbun's tales. Charles Rathbun was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Almost from the start, the photographer was the focal point of the Sobek case. But when murder is more random, investigators must take a wider view. In Beaverton, Oregon, on the morning after Valentine's Day, 1981, police were called to a townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. There, they found the body of 18-year-old Julie Ann Reitz. She'd been shot in the back of the head with two .38 caliber bullets, apparently while running for her life. The medical examiner determined that she died between 3 and 4 a.m. As investigators processed the crime scene, Detective Dave Bishop gathered the first important clue.
The telltale signs were that the victim knew whoever killed her. The door was unlocked, the stereo was on, there was a couple wine glasses in the sink.
Police searched the townhouse for any traces the killer may have left behind. No fingerprints were lifted, but technicians did recover hair and fiber samples. Upstairs, they found signs of a struggle.
The bed was just totally tore apart, sheets everywhere, and it was just, I mean, it was obvious that, you know, there was a war up there.
Stains on the sheets showed that a man with type B blood had had sexual relations with the victim. Within a week of the murder, detectives questioned over 150 of the victim's friends and acquaintances. Several mentioned an older man who had recently resurfaced from her past. He worked at a local club and dated her once or twice the year before. Reitz thought he was a little overbearing and decided they should just be friends. His name was Randall Woodfield. Randy had been an All-American athlete and was drafted by the Green Bay Packers for a brief stint in the NFL. He was an affable, fun-loving guy, but he was no Boy Scout. Police learned that he was on probation, having served 3 years for robbing joggers in Portland. Police arranged an interview with him. He vaguely remembered the victim, but said he hadn't seen her for months. Investigators found him candid and agreeable.
You know, if you didn't know him, he would be the guy next door. I mean, he was, and pleasant to talk to. Not, used very little profanity, soft-spoken.
Woodfield was forthcoming about his past, but suspicions were raised when he refused to submit hair samples or take a polygraph test. 7 grueling hours of interrogation produced little information, but managed to wear him down. He finally agreed to let police search his apartment.
I told the detectives the first thing that that when we went into the house to grab was the sheets off his bed, and because that was going to give us the hair and blood.
Investigators got the hair sample they wanted from Woodfield's sheets. They also found a .32 caliber bullet and a roll of athletic tape in his gym bag. Ordinarily, these items meant nothing. Now, police weren't so sure. Athletic tape was a crucial clue in a rash of unsolved rapes and murders that had been occurring along Interstate 5 for more than 2 months. Detectives wondered if they were onto something bigger than an isolated homicide. Suspicions intensified when investigators checked Woodfield's phone bill to see if he'd called Julie Reitz.
He was living with a young lady at that time, actually, who owned the house, and he was renting a portion of the house. I said, do you know whether or not he's made any phone calls to Beaverton? And her response was, probably, because I just got the phone bill today and it was over $200 and some. He said, he's called everybody.
He obtained a copy of Woodfield's phone bill from his housemate. When he was on the road, Woodfield liked to stay in touch with former girlfriends, charging calls to his housemate's phone. Bishop searched the bill for Reitz's number. He didn't find it, but the other numbers on the bill formed a chilling pattern.
But all of a sudden, as I'm going through this, it became very obvious that what I'm seeing is scary. It's the map of I-5.
Beginning in December 1980, a predator hunted along Interstate 5 over 3 states, robbing roadside establishments, sodomizing and killing the young women who worked there. A task force had been set up to track the killer's movements, to gather the paltry clues. He was rigorously consistent, preying on strangers, leaving no prints.
Dark hair, dark eyed, described as handsome.
He often wore false beards and hoods.
About 6'2".
On January 18, 1981, 1 month before Reitz was killed, police and rescue were called to an office building in Salem, Oregon, several miles down I-5 from where Julie Reitz was killed.
What do you got?
Lisa Garcia and Sherry Hull had been cleaning an office when an intruder slipped in. The women were sexually assaulted. Both were shot in the back of the head. Astonishingly, Garcia never lost consciousness. Though groggy and confused, she was able to dial 911. A twist of fate had kept 2 bullets from entering Garcia's brain. Hull was not so fortunate. She died at the hospital. Detectives analyzed the office crime scene. They collected hair and fiber samples and 2 .32 caliber slugs. The evidence and the method of attack matched the profile of a killer who'd been creating a one-man crime wave. Oregon detectives believed they may have stumbled onto the trail of the serial killer who prowled Interstate 5. The I-5 killer's victims were always attractive young women with long hair. He would often bind their wrists with the same brand of white athletic tape. And when he killed, it was with bullets to the back of the head. Many robbery victims had caught a glimpse of him, but Lisa Garcia was the only one who had seen him kill. He was described as a white male in his 20s with dark, bushy hair. He wore an adhesive bandage on his nose, probably to distract his victims from noting his features. But police still didn't know who he was. He had committed more than 20 acts of rape and robbery and was already suspected of killing 5 women. Julie Reitz made it 6. Like the office building Garcia was shot in, Reitz's house was along the I-5 corridor. Garcia gave the I-5 killer a face. Reitz gave him a possible name, Randall Woodfield. The blood and hair samples gathered from Woodfield's apartment, bolstered by the paper trail of his phone bill, gave authorities enough evidence to go to Woodfield's home and arrest him for suspicion of murder as the I-5 killer. But to build their case, they needed as much evidence as they could muster. Lisa Garcia, the sole survivor of the I-5 killer's murderous attacks, was called in to identify him.
Either in the yes or the no column, if it's not the mayor, on this sheet that I've given.
Do what I say and you won't get hurt. Don't call the police. Where's the back room?
Thank you.
A lineup was arranged. Participants were asked to recite statements made by the I-5 killer.
Stand up to the microphone, please.
The circumstantial evidence against Randall Woodfield was strong.
Indicated that are underlined.
His physical description and movements matched the killer's profile. His housemate confirmed that he was out of the house on the nights the killer struck. The hairs from Woodfield's bedroom matched the strands found in Julie Rietz's bed and in the office building where Lisa Garcia was attacked. He had type B blood.
Do what I say and you won't get hurt. Don't call the police.
All the police needed was a credible eyewitness.
Do what I say and you won't get hurt.
Lisa Garcia unequivocally picked Woodfield from the lineup. It was the voice, she said, that clinched it. If the bullet found in his apartment could be linked to the .32 caliber slug removed from Lisa Garcia's skull, the case against Woodfield would be a lock. But police faced two problems. The single bullet found in his possession hadn't been fired, so it bore no marks that would enable police to compare it with a bullet from any crime scene. And worse, they had no gun to test fire it with. Traditional ballistics testing would be useless. Instead, investigators needed to compare the bullets atom by atom. At Oregon State University's Radiation Center, analyst Michael Conradi uses nuclear power to put criminals behind bars.
They called us up and described the evidence that they had and asked us if we could help them with that. We told them that that was an ideal situation and for activation analysis.
Conradi received 4 bullet fragments from crimes police suspected were the work of the I-5 killer. He was also given the bullet found in Woodfield's gym bag. His job was to see if they matched. Manufacturers produce bullets in batches. Each tank of lead contains different amounts of the trace elements silver, copper, tin, antimony, and arsenic. A process called neutron activation analysis allows scientists to compare minute levels of these elements. This enables them to identify bullets produced in the same batch. Conradi cuts a sample from the bullet, flattens it into a wafer, and cleans it in nitric acid to remove contaminants. A pneumatic tube sends it on its 16-foot underwater journey to the core of a nuclear reactor. At the core, the sample is bombarded with subatomic particles called neutrons. Some of the atoms in the sample absorb some of these neutrons. The sample becomes unstable, releasing the extra neutrons in a burst of energy, in a process known as radioactive decay. Every element releases this radiation in its own unique and consistent pattern. By reading the pattern, the element and its quantity can be identified. Once the container is shuttled back to the lab, Conradi has to hurry before the radioactivity diminishes. Otherwise, he'll have nothing to analyze.
I have a minute to get the sample out, decapsulated, and on the detector.
He places the disc on a computerized sensor. The system produces a pattern showing the relative amounts of each trace element in his sample. If the unfired shot from Randall Woodfield's apartment matched the slug removed from Garcia, the suspect wouldn't be able to dodge a conviction.
Gary, you got the IR for the Woodfield
The samples
bullet?
yielded an identical pattern. Neutron activation analysis proved that the bullet fragments from the crime scene and the bullet from Woodfield's apartment came from the same batch. The bullet from his apartment matched the one taken from Lisa Garcia. Fiber, hair, and telephone records tied him to several other crime scenes. Woodfield was a sly, methodical killer who prepared for his attacks with a ritualistic intensity. His pattern was as consistent as it was deadly. His formula for targeting random victims made him seem unstoppable. But then he broke his routine and turned on someone he knew. That ultimately led to his capture. Based on the evidence, investigators assembled the final hours of Julie Reed's.
Mr. Woodfield would come to her house at approximately 3 in the morning, contact her. He had been drinking.
Hey, Julie.
Hi.
How you doing?
Asked if he could crash there for a while.
Just thought I'd come by to see you.
Yeah.
She apparently agreed. They had a couple of glasses of wine. She put on some coffee.
It's been okay because that's really all I have.
Oh yeah, that's great.
Because I think that's all I have. Here, it's in here somewhere. Just give me one.
At that time, he pulled the gun, took her upstairs,
No, what are you doing? What is?
raped her, sodomized her, and then coming down the stairs, shot her twice in the back of the head.
Armed with an imposing forensics case, the prosecution was able to prove that Randall Woodfield was the I-5 killer. He was found guilty of murder, attempted murder, and 2 counts of sodomy. He is currently serving life plus 165 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary. A killer's motivations often lie beyond the scope of forensic investigators. Detectives must satisfy themselves with learning how, when, and by whom a murder was committed. On the afternoon of April 3rd, 1985, a bridge club convened at the Boonesboro, Virginia home of Derek and Nancy Haysom. Though both their cars were in the driveway, neither 72-year-old Derek nor his wife answered the door. Fearing trouble, the guests called a family friend who came over with a spare key. They were alarmed. Derek never missed their weekly game, certainly not when he was hosting. Inside, investigators from the Bedford County Sheriff's Department were faced with a gruesome scene.
Anybody call the coroner yet?
They determined that Derek and Nancy Haysom had been killed the previous weekend. Their throats were slashed, their bodies marred by numerous wounds. Detectives eliminated robbery as a motive for the killing. There was no forced entry, no valuables or money taken. The floors were smeared with blood. Investigators wondered whether the odd patterns pointed to a cult killing. Forensics expert Steve Rush was one of the first on the scene.
The entire floor had been wiped in blood. All this kind of took me back because it was so unusual that somebody would, at that time, I thought, play in the blood.
As investigators scoured the scene for evidence, they realized that the cryptic swirls were actually the work of a murderer trying to cover his tracks. They feared he may have succeeded all too well. Normally, a messy crime scene yields many clues, but the scene at the Haysom house in Virginia wasn't the aftermath of a sloppy killer. When the criminal noticed that he was leaving footprints, he removed his shoes and camouflaged the tracks. A single print survived. The oak flooring on which it appeared was sent to the lab for analysis. At the Virginia Division of Forensic Science, Dr. Robert Hallett uses footprints to stop criminals in their tracks. He works from life-size photos to keep the original prints free from damage. From telltale weave patterns, he could see that the print from the Haysom house came from a foot in a sock. A bare foot would have made his job easier, because feet, like hands, bear tiny grooves called friction ridges. A print expert relies on these ridges to precisely match a footprint to a person.
They can make a positive identification to the exclusion of anyone else. They could say that that print was made by the person who gave them a known impression. That's not possible in this examination.
Hallett would have to base his analysis simply on the foot's anatomy. Though the photograph from the Haysom house indicated that the foot had been dragged, Hallett was pleased with the evidence.
The impression is complete. I have a heel, I have an arch, I have a metatarsal pad or ball of the foot, and I have 5 toes that are distinctly shown. And that is considered to be an excellent photograph to work with.
But until Hallett had something to compare it against, the bloody sock print would be useless. He would have to wait for a suspect to surface. Despite the lack of hard evidence, lead investigator Lieutenant Ricky Gardner was already forming an impression of the assailant.
It was obvious from the get-go that whoever performed or committed the murders was very angry with both Mr. and Miss Haysom.
The Haysoms appeared to have known their assailant and had even shared a meal. Stale remnants of food and wine lingered at 2 place settings, but 3 chairs, not 2, appeared to have been pushed back abruptly from the table. The Haysoms were killed by someone they didn't fear, but should have. Gardner's team searched for any small clue they could find, any hint of the killer. They tried to elicit latent fingerprints by sealing the house and pumping it full of superglue fumes. Hours passed as they laboriously analyzed a house full of fingerprints. But out of the thousands lifted from every surface, no suspicious ones could be found. The killer left no fingerprints. Now investigators were out for blood, hoping to track the killer's movements by the bloody trail he left. To reveal subtle traces, the forensics team used luminol. The chemical combines with blood, even drops imperceptible to the human eye. When the light goes out, the luminol-enhanced blood glows under an alternate light source and filter.
The luminol indicated to us one person coming out of the house, going down to the driveway, and appearing to get into an automobile. These were photographed and swabs were taken and was identified as blood.
The victim's blood, tracked on the killer's socks, revealed only one set of prints. It confirmed a lone assassin. A more intense search continued inside to see what else the blood might reveal. Once again, they pored over every inch of the house, looking for telltale clues of the killer's movements. Through most of the house, the luminol told investigators nothing they didn't already know. Then, in the bathroom, the chemical revealed one single drop separated from the rest. The killer failed to completely wash it away. Detectives supposed it came from the killer's own wound. Testing showed that the droplet was type O. It could not have come from Derek, who was type A, nor Nancy, who was type AB. If the killer had bled elsewhere in the house, his blood would have been mixed with the victim's and been rendered unidentifiable. The careful killer had left a vague trail, but no hints about the motive. Investigators questioned friends and family, asking each where they'd been on the weekend of the murder and checking every story. No suspect surfaced. They hoped that the Haysom's daughter, Elizabeth, could provide information, since she had only recently left home. A freshman at the University of Virginia, she was an extremely bright young woman educated in Swiss and English boarding schools. She described the Haysoms as warm and loving parents. She couldn't imagine who would want them dead. Elizabeth said that she and her boyfriend had been in Washington, D.C. when the murders occurred. She was able to provide movie stubs from the weekend. In checking her alibi, Gardner obtained their hotel and car rental receipts. The documents raised more questions than they answered. The car rental receipt showed they'd driven 669 miles, but the round trip from Charlottesville to D.C. is only 240 miles.
when I went to Charlottesville to talk to Elizabeth, I confronted her with the fact that we had learned of this, and she stated that they had done a lot of traveling and had gotten lost on several occasions. And I'd say, you have to get major loss to have that many miles on a car.
It was inconceivable that they racked up an additional 429 miles in 2 days of city driving, unless a trip to Boonesboro was added to the equation. Gardner contacted Elizabeth's boyfriend to hear his side. Jens Soring, a German citizen and son of a diplomat, shared Elizabeth's intellect and international background. The Jefferson scholar hardly seemed the violent type. Like Elizabeth, he said they had put the extra miles on the car when they got lost while sightseeing. Suspicions peaked when Jens refused to supply a blood sample or foot impression, claiming his involvement might endanger his father's diplomatic status. Police arranged a second interview with Jens. He never showed. Instead, Elizabeth's half-brother found a note in Elizabeth's apartment. In the note, Jens explained that he and Elizabeth, weary of the investigation, had left town. He asserted his innocence, claiming that he was not a violent person. A search was conducted. Jens and Elizabeth could not be found.
Well, since you've read, you already know. They're not coming back here.
Several days later, Jens's car was located 340 miles away at Newark Airport. Detectives believed that the couple had fled to Europe. With their international backgrounds, Elizabeth and Jens would have no trouble covering their tracks abroad. Interpol was notified, but had no recourse. No charges had been filed, no evidence against them had been gathered. The investigation came to a screeching halt. All police could hope for was that one day soon, the couple would slip up and resurface. Seven months passed. The prime suspects had fled to Europe. Then, in May 1986, a British detective searched the flat of a young couple who'd been arrested for check scamming. Browsing through a box of their love letters, he realized that they were guilty of more than fraud. The lovers had planned a murder. The letters and diary told a far different story than either Jens or Elizabeth had shared with police back in Virginia. Elizabeth had loathed her parents and their smothering involvement in her life. She particularly resented their intent to separate her from Jens. She wanted them dead. Would it be possible to hypnotize my parents, she wrote, do voodoo on them, will them to death? Why won't my parents just lie down and die? I despise them so much. Jens wrote that he was willing to help concoct a scheme to pull it off. A constable from Scotland Yard contacted Detective Gardner.
And he says, I understand you may be interested in Jens Soring or Elizabeth Haysom. And I'm going, yeah? All the time, you know, I'm sliding up in the chair a little bit more. And he says, were her parents murdered?
Gardner caught the next plane to England to confront Jens and Elizabeth with their own words. Elizabeth, struck with remorse, admitted she knew about the murders beforehand, but didn't commit them.
I think that was...
I'd never seen it.
She returned to Virginia for trial. Jens admitted killing the Haysoms, but as a German citizen, he hoped to get his case moved to Germany, where he would be tried as a minor. If found guilty there, he'd do only a few years' time. Then he could be reunited with Elizabeth.
He advised me that he was ready to tell me the truth, and he just started with when they met in the fall of, he and Elizabeth met in the fall of '84. They fell in love, and one thing led to another.
Jens told Gardner that he was so in love with Elizabeth, he'd do anything for her, even kill.
I mean, he was smitten, obviously, by Elizabeth. I mean, this was probably, if not the one of the first relationship that he had ever had. And I mean, she had manipulated him into the feeling that, you know, you're my future, and we'll spend the rest of our lives together, and you're my only love. And he went for it. He fell for it.
But back in Virginia, Elizabeth turned on her lover. She portrayed Jens as a bloodthirsty psychotic who killed without much urging. She'd lived in a state of terror afterwards, she said, fearing that Jens would kill her if she went to the police. On August 24, 1987, Elizabeth pleaded guilty to being an accessory before the fact. She thought she'd get off easy, but she was sentenced to 90 years in prison. Jens fought extradition for 3 years. Then the United Kingdom agreed to extradite him when Virginia promised it would not seek the death penalty if he were found guilty. When it was clear Jens was to face hard time in the States, he changed his story, pinning the murders on Elizabeth. He claimed that the roles of killer and accessory were reversed. Elizabeth had killed her parents while he stayed in Washington. He'd lied about it until now to protect her. Jens was a good storyteller, but forensics would provide the definitive account. The next step in the Haysom murder investigation took place in the lab, where Elizabeth Haysom and Jens Soring made footprints.
And now I want you to walk through. Be sure all parts are touching. All right, stop. All right, now just walk right on through.
Robert Hallett compared these impressions with the print gathered at the crime scene. Transparencies were made of the prints. Hallett drew parallel lines through each image to compare them. A distinguishing feature appeared on the photograph of the bloody print. The ball of the killer's foot formed a plateau between the second and third toes. Following the line, Hallett found a striking similarity with Soring's footprint.
It exactly touched those same two positions on the impression of Jens Soring. However, when that parallel line, keeping it equidistant all the way across, came to this position for Elizabeth Haysom, the pad, metatarsal pad, was significantly below, quite a bit below.
Elizabeth's print didn't have this feature and was eliminated. Hallett tested Jens's print further.
This is the impression that we're trying to determine as to who made. And I've placed an overlay over it, the right foot of Jens Soring, placement of the toes, metatarsal pad, the ball of the foot, the arch, and the heel, all exactly match. There were no differences.
In Hallett's opinion, Jens Soring had left the print.
The foot that made that impression was either that foot by Jens Soring or someone that had a foot exactly like his, and I've never seen such a condition to exist.
Next, a sample of Soring's blood was tested against the single droplet found on the floor of the Haysom's bathroom. They matched. Both were type O. Soring couldn't get around the evidence in the case. A single sock print and one wayward drop of blood indisputably put him in the house on the night of the murder. His own letters spoke of premeditation.
I'll get it.
At trial, an account of the murder was pieced together. Jens and Elizabeth had met in school, but the Haysoms didn't think Jens was good enough for their daughter. They had been threatening to use their influence to have Jens expelled from the university.
Come on.
Determined to stay together, Jens said, he and Elizabeth made a plan. While she created an alibi in Washington, Jens drove to Boonesboro to kill her parents. They invited him in. He made a final plea to keep dating their daughter. Derek Haysom refused. He swore he'd do everything in his power to keep them apart. That's when Jens lost control. He pulled the knife he'd purchased that day and killed the Haysoms. For his crimes, Jens Soring was found guilty of first-degree murder and given 2 life sentences. Forensic science can't explain a killer's lethal obsessions, but detectives and the scientists they rely on are driven by obsessions of their own. In the field or in the lab, they are on a mission to stop killers, no matter how long it takes. In Reno, Nevada, 2 unidentified women are found dead. Can tiny fibers tie them to their killer? A skeleton, a shopping bag, and a single button are investigators' only clues to the identity of a woman and her killer. A sailor is killed on a Florida beach. Only a tire track in the sand marks the path to justice. The clues to murder often elude the naked eye. But no killer can escape the telltale traces of guilt. Reno, Nevada is known as a betting town. In February of 1995, someone gambled he could kill without a trace. A transient man was searching a dumpster for things he could sell when he made a gruesome discovery. Officers from the Reno police arrived and retrieved the body of an unidentified woman. It was almost completely camouflaged among the debris. For police, the myth of the perfect murder was dispelled long ago. Today, forensic science can win convictions from the most minute clues. But in this case, the killer seemed almost to be playing the odds. He could have disposed of the body in the desert, where no one would ever find it. Instead, he crafted an elaborate parcel, conspicuous because of its size, and hoped the dumpster would be empty before it was found. The complexity of the shroud was disturbing. The victim had been slipped into several large plastic garbage bags, which had then been carefully sewn inside a sleeping bag. The bundle was then wrapped in yellow plastic and tied with rope. The initial examination of the remains was made by the lead investigator, Detective David Jenkins.
That degree of packaging was unusual because of its complexity, and immediately suggested that there had been a lot of preparation and a lot of time involved in the packaging of the body. And that's uncommon in most body disposals.
Right away, this elaborate wrapping gave police several important clues. The killer needed time to encase the victim like a modern mummy. And he needed a very private laboratory where he could do his grim work. To identify the body, detectives reviewed recent missing person reports. One case stood out. With family photographs and fingerprints, police confirmed that the victim was Catherine Powell. She had disappeared the Friday before the body was discovered.
Her disappearance was first reported that next Monday, 2 days later, when she failed to show up to work. Miss Powell was an elementary school teacher, a very popular teacher. She was loved by her students and the other staff. And so immediately when she was reported as missing, there was a sense of urgency, both by her staff and by her family, who felt that her disappearance was far more sinister than just her not wanting to arrive at work.
At her home, police saw no signs of forced entry or violence.
This is basically how you left it.
But when her family looked over the apartment, they noticed several items missing, including a laptop computer and printer, a camera, and her purse.
Yeah, she used to, she could tell.
While detectives combed her apartment, forensics investigators pored over the evidence from the dumpster. If the wrappings held a clue to the killer's identity, investigators couldn't find it. They had never seen a case like this before, and the killer's attention to detail made them nervous. Investigators focused on the remains. The ropes and wrappings were preserved for later analysis. Police were not even sure how the victim had died. There was no indication of fatal trauma on the body. Forensic science would have to tell the story. And for an expert eye, there were many trace clues to read. The Washoe County Sheriff's Forensics Lab assigned the case to investigator Rich Berger.
I don't really recall having attended an autopsy where there was such a profusion of trace evidence potential on a person's body. There was apparent a number of blue-green strings and tufts of material located basically from head to toe.
Besides the fibers, Berger found a single metal shaving tangled in the victim's hair. None of these traces matched the fibers or samples gathered at the victim's apartment. Police suspected they were linked to the killer. The victim's body also bore telltale bruises. It appeared that she had been bound, gagged, and possibly tortured. The injuries suggested the killer was male. But new information suggested he hadn't worked alone. While forensic pathologists continued to gather the minute physical evidence, Detective Jenkins studied Powell's credit card records. Any recent charges might shed light on where she had been. He saw that her card was used to buy a $2,000 stereo on February 5th, the same day she disappeared.
Exotic looking.
Yeah,
wide,
she was kind of exotic.
The clerk said he'd chatted with the woman who bought the stereo. She had claimed to be Powell.
They identified themselves as Miss Powell. They were making a purchase to give to their daughter during a wedding. We were aware, having spoken with Miss Powell's family, that Miss Powell had no children.
The clerk told police this woman did not fit the victim's description. He also recalled a crucial detail: the kind of truck the woman drove. Detectives traced it to its owner, a cable television installer named David Middleton.
That break allowed us to focus our investigative efforts specifically on an individual rather than just the overall circumstances involving her disappearance and the use of her credit cards.
Police interviewed David Middleton about Catherine Powell. Though he had recently installed cable service in her home, he said they had talked only briefly.
Do you know a lady by the name of Kathleen Powell?
He claimed ignorance about her disappearance and murder. He knew nothing about her credit cards.
What's your profession? What do you do for them?
But a background check revealed that Middleton was a convicted felon and a former police officer. While on duty in Miami, Middleton had lured a young woman into his patrol car, drove her to a secluded place, and sexually assaulted her. Stripped of his badge, Middleton served 3 years in prison. Upon release, he moved to Colorado and then to Nevada. Middleton's girlfriend was charged with fraud for using Catherine Powell's credit card. But because Middleton's truck was used in the crime, police now had grounds to search his home.
We found a firearm, a shotgun. Mr. Middleton in the state of Nevada, because he is a convicted felon, was prohibited by law from possessing that weapon.
Possession of the shotgun was a felony. But while it was cause for Middleton's arrest, it did not implicate him in Powell's murder. Police found no fiber evidence at his home to link him to the crime. Middleton was interrogated again. This time he changed his story. Now he admitted to beginning a sexual relationship with Catherine Powell. He said that he had been with her one night, then left for an hour. When he returned, she was dead. He refused to offer any more information. Middleton was now a prime suspect in Catherine's murder. But investigators had not a scrap of real evidence to link him to the crime. At the Washoe County Forensic Science Lab in Reno, the fibers found clinging to Catherine Powell's body were leading investigators nowhere. Desperate for clues, they re-examined the bruises on the victim's body. Right away, they focused on one in particular. It had an unusual crescent shape. Suspecting it was a bite mark, Detective Jenkins sought the help of forensic odontologist Raymond Rawson.
Well, I saw just a few pictures of a body that had been autopsied, and there was a bruise on the left chest area, just almost to the armpit. It was a bruise that stood out from anything else on the body, so and it had the characteristics of a bite mark.
Hoping this mark would lead them to the suspect, X-rays and plaster impressions were taken of Middleton's teeth and sent to Dr. Rawson. He wondered how hard a person would need to bite in order to leave a bruise like the one found on the victim.
And if you see that, it leaves an indentation. Now, there's no bruising, and we found that you have to actually bite so hard that you can't stand it to create a bruise. So when we see a bruise on the skin, we know that there were at least 200 pounds pressure, and that wasn't a willing situation. Somebody would cry out in pain.
Next, Dr. Rawson compared Middleton's bite pattern with the bruise on the victim's body. He placed the X-ray of the biting edges over a photograph of the bite mark. The details of the X-ray matched the bruise.
We had one tooth that had a wear pattern on it, and that wear pattern was shown in the bruise. So it was a very good match.
The bite mark confirmed that Middleton was with Powell near the time of her death. A bruise this severe was no playful love bite. But neither was it evidence of murder. Police needed more concrete evidence. As news of the case spread, an anonymous informant called the police with a potential clue. Middleton had rented a large storage unit in nearby Sparks, Nevada. A search warrant was immediately served there.
That information was significant because for the first time we were able to locate a specific location where the kinds of activities involving the packaging of the body and the keeping of a body could have occurred.
A storage unit would make a perfect workshop for a killer. Even before detectives entered the shed, They were suspicious of the amount of recent activity there. The entry records, obtained by Deputy District Attorney Tom Deloria, showed how often Middleton visited the unit.
Well, we know from the gate entries, which was computerized at the storage facility, that Dave Middleton made numerous entries into that storage unit the Friday evening that Kathy Powell was abducted from her residence, Saturday, again Sunday, again Monday, again last entry being Tuesday morning.
Were police walking into a glorified closet or a killer's lair? They knew their case against Middleton hinged on what they found here. At first, the shed was unremarkable, crammed with personal property. And anywhere else, the duct tape and coils of rope would have seemed harmless. When they found the stereo receiver that was purchased with the victim's credit card, they knew they were onto something. Then they found the items missing from the victim's home. But police already knew Middleton had been to her apartment. Evidence of burglary does not prove murder.
Woman's wig.
The handcuffs were perhaps a souvenir of Middleton's police days. But the scraps of women's underwear and a stun gun were not so easy to explain away, especially in light of what they found next.
Find another clue.
A refrigerator lay on its back. The freezer's bottom had been cut away, and small, jagged air holes had been drilled into the sides. It had been modified, apparently to hold a human body. Above the refrigerator dangled a system of ropes and pulleys strong enough to hoist a human being. The detectives could only begin to imagine what perversions were acted out here.
This was a torture chamber, simply put. The refrigerator, having been placed on its back, almost suggested a coffin.
But did Middleton's depravity go as far as murder? Investigators still had to link him to the victim. In the refrigerator, they saw small blue-green fibers and human hair. As clues, they provided a glimmer of hope in a room full of horror. The refrigerator was brought back to the crime lab, where Rich Berger analyzed the fibers. To him, the threads in the refrigerator appeared to match those found on Powell's body, and genetic markers from the hair were consistent with the victim's.
The fibers from Powell's body were 100% cotton of a blue-green color, and that similarly those from the refrigerator were composed of 100% cotton and the same color. And that also the metal fragment from Catherine Powell's hair matched the metal and paint that went into the makeup of the freezer compartment of the refrigerator.
The metal shaving found in the victim's hair matched the metal from the crude air holes. Investigators found the link they were looking for. The trace evidence proved that the victim was in David Middleton's storage unit. Detectives now formed a theory of how she died. The air holes were simply inadequate to keep her alive. She had suffocated. While investigators were grappling with the monstrous acts of David Middleton, they learned that Powell may not have been his only victim. On April 9th, a man was walking his dog outside Verde, Nevada. he found the skeletonized remains of a human being. They were entangled in knotted ropes and plastic garbage bags. Police brought the remains to the crime lab. Criminalists compared its DNA to a sample from an unsolved missing persons case. They made a positive match. A check of dental records confirmed the victim's ID. She was Thelma DeVilla, who worked at one of the larger casinos in the area. She had been missing since August 8, 1994, the exact day Middleton had rented the storage shed. The excessive ropes, knots, and garbage bags found on DeVilla's remains mirrored those found on Catherine Powell's body. The knots provided information about the victim's final hours. The stresses applied to the knots showed that both women were alive when their hands and feet were bound, and they had struggled desperately against the ropes before they died.
We specifically looked at knots from two different murders and compared them to each other, showing that the same types of knots had been used in both these deaths.
DeVilla's DNA was then compared to the DNA traces found in Middleton's shed. The results were ironclad. Like Powell, she had been in the shed. But the DNA traces of several other people were also found there. If David Middleton was a serial killer, Powell and DeVilla were the only victims ever found. As the case against Middleton was prepared, the grim sequence of events leading to Powell's death became clear. Middleton, working as a cable TV installer, had probably gained access to her home under the pretext of checking her cable service. He then subdued her and took her to his storage shed. There, she was tied up, brutalized, and kept confined in the airless refrigerator. Sometime during this torture, she died. Middleton methodically wrapped her body in plastic garbage bags, sewed it into a sleeping bag, and enshrouded the bundle with yellow plastic bound with rope. Finally, under cover of night, he disposed of the remains in the dumpster. Police were fortunate the body was ever found. But Middleton didn't realize that a brimming dumpster would appeal not only to him, but also to a transient looking for scraps. He had been clever up to a point. The investigation uncovered the fact that Middleton had installed cable service in an apartment near Thelma DeVilla's home the week before she disappeared. And on the day of DeVilla's disappearance, a neighbor remembered seeing Middleton near her home. On September 15, 1997, the jury convicted David Middleton of 2 counts of first-degree murder.
Without the DNA evidence, without the trace and fiber evidence, without the metal evidence and experts, and most importantly, the testimony of our pathologist, we would have had no case. Without the trace evidence, we had nothing.
This evidence was so compelling that Middleton was condemned to 2 sentences of death by lethal injection.
Dave Middleton is not your typical killer. All I can say about this guy, as opposed to most of them, is certainly he's police smart and he's street smart. And when you have that, that's a dangerous combination.
Whether murder is committed in an urban jungle or far out in the countryside, some trace of the deed will be left to tell the tale. March 22, 1988. Deep in a forest south of St. Louis, there began one of the most baffling cases ever encountered by the Missouri State Highway Patrol.
And try to determine whether it's an Indian grave or it's a fresh grave, or it appears that it's been here for some time.
The case concerned fragments of a human skeleton. Was this an innocent, ancient death, or the victim of some monstrous modern crime? It would take some of the most specialized skills in forensic science to decide.
16 feet.
Sergeants Don Bazzelli, William Conway, and D.W. Kreitz were among the first on the scene.
I received a phone call from the ranger at the Boy Scout camp who advised me that he had discovered some skeletal remains. I went to the scout camp and he directed me to the graveside.
The investigation had its origins 4 months earlier. Raimo Pitkänen, a surveyor from Finland and former Eagle Scout, had been hired to make a map of the SF Boy Scout ranch. On November 2, 1987, he made an unwelcome discovery. Frightened of becoming involved, Pitkänen told no one what he found until just before his return to Finland.
Well, Interpol had the Finnish authorities contact the gentleman in Helsinki and conducted an interview with him, which was sent to us in Finnish, after which we had to have translated.
For nearly a week, investigators combed the site. Pickings were thin, a skull and lower jaw, a few strands of dark hair, and an assortment of bones, some scattered several hundred feet from the grave. Many showed tooth marks, signs they had been chewed by animals.
It's a very shallow grave. The bones, doesn't look like we're going to have many bones in it. We're finding on the outer perimeter a couple of bones that may belong to what we've got here. We're going to have to look into it. It's not much to go on right now.
But as the investigation continued, clues slowly began to emerge, including a plastic shopping bag.
We first thought that they could have been an Indian burial site, but then when we excavated the grave, finding the service merchandise bag and determining that it was probably from 1979 to 1985, finding that down in the grave really helped us.
There was another clue, one which would eventually narrow down the identity of the victim, a single metal button. Stamped across its face was a logo, Texwood. The next few weeks were frustrating for Conway and his colleagues. Preliminary investigations suggested the remains came from a young woman, perhaps 25 to 30 years of age, the mother of 2 or more children. Surely someone had reported her missing.
Well, the victim was first identified as a Caucasian female, and we started checking missing person reports on Caucasian females, and there were quite a few that fit the approximate age and size and weight of what we had.
In fact, this victim should have been especially easy to identify. She had perfect teeth.
The skull and the remaining teeth indicated no dental work and no cavities, which is very rare in our society, and we were able to eliminate a number of the suspected missing persons that we were investigating.
Soon, the investigators had eliminated all the missing persons from Missouri and from a half-dozen surrounding states. The skeleton in the woods was not a missing person, or rather, no one had reported this young woman as missing. The investigators decided to try another approach. They contacted forensic anthropologist Michael Charney at Colorado State University. He had a remarkable talent for identifying individuals from the most fragmentary skeletons. With near miraculous skill, he could often reconstruct the age, sex, and race, even the facial appearance of a missing person.
I said, wait a minute, the first thing hit me is that this was not a white person. This was Oriental.
This was somebody of Mongoloid extraction, American Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Eskimo, something of that nature.
Charney had picked up on something the police investigators missed. White people and black people have relatively long, narrow faces. People of Mongolian and Asian heritage have much broader faces. Meanwhile, police investigators were making progress of their own with other physical evidence from the grave. Their attention centered on that button with the curious Texwood logo.
We thought when we found the button it would be an easy thing to identify. The word Texwood being on the button, we called Texas, trying to find someone down there that might know it. We found all kind of manufacturers with the name Tex and Texwood in Texas, but nothing would match. Finally, we called U.S. Customs. Within a couple hours, got a call back to contact an agent in New York who put me in touch with the representative of Texwood, who they manufacture the jeans, the blue jeans, in Hong Kong, and they're called the Levi of the Orient.
Texwood sold jeans exclusively in the Far East, slender cuts specifically designed for Asian figures. The police's portrait of the victim was growing clearer. More important, it matched the picture given by Michael Charney, a slim woman, Asian, in her mid or late 20s, a mother of 2 or more children. The likelihood of the victim being from Asia dramatically narrowed the field of possible victims. But who was she? One of the many leads police pursued involved a missing person in Georgia, an Asian female. Officers investigating the case obtained a photo of the woman, which they sent to Charney. Michael Charney's approach was simple in theory, but tricky in practice. Take a photograph of the skull and superimpose it over the image of the possible victim. The fit must be exact if an identification is to be made. Would Charney and his colleague Nita Bittner be able to match the police photographs to the skull found in the woods at the Boy Scout camp?
In this case, when we got the eyes and the nose in close proximity, the nose still doesn't match. It's too broad. The cheek depth is too far apart or not far enough on one side. The teeth are a mismatch and the chin is still out of place. After trying and refocusing for size and other distortions, we were still unable to come up with a match.
By now, every attempt to identify the victim had failed. Charney had one last suggestion: recreate the woman's face. The reconstruction of a face from a skull is among the most specialized and most spectacular skills in a forensic anthropologist's arsenal. It begins with mathematical precision. A collection of round rubber pegs of varying lengths glued to a plaster cast of the skull.
And there's another one that goes right in.
The pegs are landmarks, each identifying the thickness of soft tissue at particular points on the face. Next, the pegs are connected with strips of modeling clay. Bit by bit, humanity returns. Plastic eyes are placed in the sockets, and the skull comes to life. Careful modeling, perhaps dabbing with a damp sponge, gives the texture of skin. Paint, a black wig, will complete the transformation. For the first time, we can glimpse the victim face to face.
In doing a facial reconstruction, it's not as important that it's absolutely accurate, but that it gives a glimpse of who the person was to somebody out there who will hopefully recognize it. When we do our facial reconstructions, it's generally a last-ditch attempt.
Now, would anyone recognize the face rebuilt by Michael Charney's team? August 24th, a photograph of the reconstructed face appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. 3 days later, 2 informants claimed that the photo looked like their friend, Bunchi Nyhouse. A mother of 2, she was a native of Thailand. They had not seen her since late 1983. Bunchi had a husband, Richard Nyhouse, an ex-GI whom she had met in Bangkok during the Vietnam War.
When we first talked to Mr. Niehaus, he appeared to be an upstanding citizen. He maintained a nice house by himself, clean, very upstanding citizen in a nice neighborhood. He was gainfully employed full-time. He was raising 2 sons on his own. They attended church, were very good students.
Niehaus had a ready explanation for his wife's absence. In December 1983, he and Bun Chi had a series of bitter arguments. She had insisted on leaving him and their 2 sons and returning to Bangkok. It was a story the officers didn't entirely believe. The way to resolve the matter was to eliminate Bun Chi as the victim in the forest grave.
He was very cooperative. He provided me photos out of their photo album of his wife that we could use if we needed to in the investigation.
The photograph was not ideal, but Michael Charney did his best.
Like any photograph at an angle would be, you have to get it in the same 2 planes exactly, you see.
Despite the difficulties of matching the position of face and skull, in the end, Michael Charney had no doubt that this was Bun Chi.
We first received word from our lab that Dr. Charney had matched the photographs of Bun Chi Niehaus to the remains that we had recovered. And at that time, the case took on a whole new outlook. We now knew who our victim was, and we also had a good suspect to start with in Mr. Niehaus.
The investigators quickly uncovered a series of incriminating facts. Richard Niehaus and his wife frequently had noisy arguments. He had taken several days off work in December 1983, the same time his wife disappeared. Soon after she vanished, Niehaus divorced Bun Chi and removed her as a beneficiary of his insurance. And then one final damning discovery.
We ultimately discovered that he was a Boy Scout leader, which then tied right into the fact that her remains were found in a Boy Scout camp. He had been actively involved with Boy Scouts with his children for many years.
By now, Richard Niehaus was the primary suspect. The investigators decided to invite him in for further questioning. They chose their moment with care. A weekend when Niehaus was camping at the SF Ranch, not far from where his wife's body had been hidden. The officers informed Niehaus the remains they had recovered had been identified as those of his wife. Niehaus admitted he had pushed his wife, who had fallen and hurt her head. When she threatened to call the police, to leave him, taking the children with her, he bent down, put his hand over her nose and mouth, and held it there until she was dead. Then he hid her body in the freezer.
The reason that we weren't getting any hits out of the computer files is that the victim's husband never reported her missing. He said that he took her to the airport and she went back to Thailand, but in fact he murdered her. Kept her in his house, in the freezer, for 3 months, and then took her down to the Boy Scout ranch and buried her.
Richard Niehaus was convicted of first-degree murder. He is now serving a life sentence without parole. Time and the elements had taken their toll on Bun Chi's body, adding to the difficulty of finding her killer. But even just a few hours can make the difference between solving a case and losing the trail forever. In September 1983, 2 friends near Jacksonville, Florida were shocked to find the body of a man. He lay on his side at the foot of a sand dune. His head showed severe wounds. Investigators from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office quickly responded. They found no identification on the body. The only clues were a broken pool cue and footprints leading to some tire tracks in the sand. Police worked carefully to gather and protect all the evidence. The tire tracks seemed like the most promising clue to lead to the killer. They were lucky to have it. Rain, the slightest breeze, or one false step could destroy the fragile traces. Preserving the tire tracks required particular expertise. The very act of making a cast could destroy them. Police called the Jacksonville Regional Crime Laboratory and forensic criminalist Ernest Ham.
So the crime scene was processed with these tracks in mind. The footwear tracks and the tire tracks were photographed. Then we want to make a plaster cast, because a plaster cast will give us a true representation, a three-dimensional representation of the object that made it.
Care in the pouring was crucial in order to prevent the weight of the plaster from destroying the print. If the evidence were altered, a killer might go free. After the plaster had set, the cast was carefully cleaned. Now, police had a perfect three-dimensional reproduction of the tire tread. It included the gouges and signs of wear that made that tire unique. But millions of tires roll on America's highways today. It seemed impossible for investigators to find the one tire that had made these tracks. They studied the plaster cast, noting the ribs and grooves of the tread design. Despite the odds of finding the tire, it offered investigators their best chance to catch the killer. Matching the track with a tire on a suspect's car would be as conclusive in court as a fingerprint. Ham searched through thousands of photographs in the pages of the tread design guide to find the one tire he needed. As Ham searched for a clue to the killer, another jogger found a clue to the victim. The wallet belonged to a 21-year-old sailor serving on a ship docked at the Mayport Naval Air Station in Jacksonville. An officer from the ship was called to the morgue. He confirmed that the victim was Jeffrey Michael Russell. An autopsy was performed on the victim's remains. He had been beaten, probably with the pool cue found at the scene. It bore no usable fingerprints. He had then been shot once in the head from less than 2 feet away. The pathologist recovered a .357 caliber bullet from the victim's brain. Russell's shipmates said he was well liked and had been out with friends on the night he died.
Thanks for coming, guys.
Police speculated that the victim might have even shared a round of drinks with his killers. He was last seen leaving a party, planning to hitchhike back to base. While the police traced the victim's movements, Ham continued his arduous, time-intensive search of the tread guide. Finally, after reviewing thousands of images, he found the single tire that matched the cast. The track at the beach was made by a tire commonly mounted on pickup trucks. Now, police knew what they were looking for, though it hardly seemed to advance their investigation. To find one truck out of thousands in the Jacksonville area would be daunting. But then police got a lucky break that saved them hundreds of hours. An officer, answering a call about a robbery, pulled over a suspicious truck. The driver tried to run off, but was soon apprehended and arrested. His name was Gregory Kokol. Police inspected his truck. They found a gun under the seat. Kokol was known to police. He was a suspect in a murder case several years before, though never charged. But his name had come up even more recently. Police had just received an anonymous tip that Kokol had bragged of robbing and killing a man on the beach. The gun retrieved from the truck, a .357 revolver, was the same caliber used to kill Russell. The officer then noticed that the tires seemed to resemble the ones involved in Russell's murder. Until now, solving the case had seemed like a long shot. Now, police had the prime suspect and possibly all the evidence to convict him. To make the charges stick, they'd have to link him to the scene of the crime. Police looked to the tires to make that connection. An officer compared Kokol's right front truck tire to a photograph from the tread guide.
The way he described it was that the hair stood up on the back of his neck, that he was really seeing what we told him he was going to see.
The tire was the brand and model they were looking for. But police were not certain it was the same tire that left its mark at the beach. Ham's work wasn't done. He still had to find the exact section of the tire's tread that had made the print. He scrutinized every inch of the tread, looking for cuts, gouges, and wear that matched the portion captured in plaster.
These are the marks and gouges that are put into a tire as you drive it. These will leave what we need for making a positive identification. This makes this tire unique.
But every mile driven since the night of the murder put new wear marks on the tire and altered the old ones. Even if Ham had the exact tire in his lab, it might be too late to make the perfect match. A killer could still go free. Jacksonville police were building a murder case on a foundation of sand. Now they needed harder evidence. After careful analysis, investigators found marks in Gregory Kokol's tire that matched the casting made at the crime scene. But police needed to prove that Kokol himself was there. They hoped Kokol's .357 would provide the smoking gun they needed. If this was the exact gun that fired the fatal bullet, investigators had to prove that Kokol pulled the trigger. Ham performed 3 tests designed to link the gun with the crime.
Our first examination will be a visual examination, because we want to see if there's any other sort of trace matter on the weapon before we subject it to some sort of processing techniques, such as, in this case, because it's a head wound, if it was a close head wound, we could possibly have tissue blowback into the weapons.
But this test was a dead end. No tissue or blood was found on the gun. The next step was to test it for fingerprints. The gun was sealed in a glass cabinet and exposed to fumes of cyanoacrylate ester, or common superglue. These fumes adhere to fingerprints, making them easier to see and compare.
But based upon the individual characteristics of the ridges, the endings and the divisions and the dots, we can make a positive identification from any part of the body that bears friction skin.
The fumes did their work in just a few minutes. The print on the gun was compared to Kokel's prints at his arrest. They were a perfect match. This one fingerprint only proved that Kokel had held the gun. It did not prove that this gun had fired the fatal bullet. That could only be determined by a ballistics test. The test-fired bullet was placed side by side on a microscope for comparison with the bullet that killed the victim. The investigator lines up the rifling patterns on both bullets. A video monitor allows him to see the minute scratches on the soft lead. If the marks align, he has proof that the same gun fired both bullets. And that's precisely what he saw. The scratch marks on both slugs were identical. Investigators had found the murder weapon. As the prosecution prepared for trial, the events of Russell's final night came into focus. As he hitchhiked back to the base, he was picked up by Gregory Kokel and a friend. But instead of dropping Russell at his quarters, they drove him to the beach, beat him, robbed him of the only dollar he had, and then Kokel shot him. Crimes committed by strangers on strangers are the hardest to solve. But the scratches on the bullet, the fingerprint, and the tire tread bore the traces of the killer's guilt. Close forensic analysis pulled them together to make a solid case against Kokel.
The weapon was the weapon that fired the fatal shot. The fingerprint belonged to the individual that was suspected of committing the crime.
The senseless, random nature of the murder assured that Gregory Kokel and his accomplice would receive stiff sentences. Forensics proved beyond a doubt that Kokel fired the fatal bullet. He was sentenced to death. His friend was deemed an accessory to murder and received 14 years. For years, only the most obvious evidence could be used to solve a murder. Today, scrupulous collection methods by police and rigorous evidence processing by forensics experts are helping to assure that nothing gets overlooked.